Chris, hi. Thanks for joining us on Architect Tomorrow. I thought it was time we introduced you properly to the community, and so have a little bit of a chat with you about your career journey and some of your kind of wisdom along the way. Chris is our CISO for Americas region at Tanium. Let's kick off with your background. What made you kind of get into technology to start with, and then was security sort of fairly soon afterwards, or what was the story into sort of security after technology?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. So, my oldest brother came home from college with computers. Actually, even before then, he had a Commodore 64,
Okay.
and all he did was play games on it. And I decided I wanted to break it out and start programming. And I got to the point where I learned enough that I actually locked him out of the C64 with a password. Well, youngest brother, I've got to, taunt and tease him. Paybacks are what they are. So it was just, kind of just me exploring. I love to tinker and take things apart. But also in high school, my senior year, I did a program where the almost the full school day was doing clinical rotations in a hospital.
Okay.
Fast forward to college, I became an EMT, an emergency medical technician on an ambulance corps.
Okay.
I was going the biology route. I just hated the biology program there, and started hanging out in the computer labs with a bunch of people. I could troubleshoot with the best of them and started just kind of tinkering more and more in that realm. Went political science as towards my major, and then ended up working for the campus computer lab.
Okay.
Initially administering Macintosh systems and locking them down so that students weren't messing them up too badly. Flipped over during one project to become a Unix sysadmin. And 2 weeks into that job is really where security became a focus. So
Right.
a computer incident that impacted about 40 systems in our School of Engineering, Linux systems. And back then, this was 97, 98 timeframe. You didn't really investigate them. You nuked the systems and you moved on. But there was a lot of data that was left behind by the intruder that
Right.
indicated where they came from, but where they were also using us to launch attacks against others. And so I made the case that we should do victim notification. And that was something that really wasn't done then.
Right.
But I got their buy-in. I did that. I spent almost a month going through all of the data and doing all of that. And that's just kind of where the trajectory started taking me more and more. I learned Kerberos extensively back then,
Mhm.
became kind of a resident expert on it, and that's what took me ultimately to work for AOL.
Okay.
I basically launched all of the Kerberos installation for what was then about 25,000 systems on raised tile. Sounds like a lot back then. Today, in our current scale of things, that's nothing. But these were actual physical systems on raised tile. Flipped over to doing purely incident response for
Okay.
AOL and the Time Warner companies. And then ended up going to RSA security for a couple of years.
Mhm.
And then before Tanium, my most recent was for about 7 years at the Department of Homeland Security US CERT.
Amazing. So, I mean, what's really interesting there is you've obviously got a range of different roles, but also a range of different industries, from like private sector, AOL, probably one of the earliest kind of high profile targets, I guess, for kind of attacks and things. And then sort of more recently, Homeland Security, which of course, for Brits like myself, we just have visions of, various Hollywood movies and things like 24 and various things like that. So I'm sure it's not quite like that in real life. But talking about those days at AOL, then what were your kind of learnings around kind of, because I guess AOL was a bit sort of different. I mean, I've always seen it as a bit of a walled garden in itself. So was it a bit different there, or
Um, I mean, so for me, that was my first time working at any kind of scale.
right?
At a university environment, 50 servers would have been a lot. Um, so working at a completely different scale,
Yeah.
the requirements around uptime dramatically different as well.
Hmm.
Sensitivity towards doing anything security related that might impact that uptime is certainly a huge concern. And also seeing for the first time that division between the internal security of like corporate network and things of that sort,
Yep.
and the operational environment that's servicing your customers. You know, and the potential for butting heads between those teams of people, and how to negotiate some of that. You know, the ops focused people in the network and data center ops group, very much concerned about keeping things secure, securing customer data, all of that. Everyone was concerned about it, of course, but the balancing act tilts very differently when you're a more creative person looking to just create the next web page for the site and figure out what the UX is going to be, versus someone running the server that's going to host it.
Yeah.
So that was my first introduction to targeted intrusions, actually.
Okay.
So not by nation states, but by 14 and 15-year-old kids that could seriously do social engineering in a way that I've yet to encounter again.
Right.
Just fantastic at it. But what they would do is, in a given year, they would launch 3,000 unique attempts at launching malware lures to different employees across the globe, trying to gain access to the internal network. Now, that's
Right.
attempts. Not all of them succeeded.
Okay. Yeah.
Some did. Some didn't. I actually got to meet face to face with one of the folks that always played around with AOL, Adrian Lamo. So he happened to be in the DC area at one point. I messaged him. We met up for coffee, and I just picked his brain for I don't know how long about just his thought process and like how he approached things.
Yeah.
But yeah, the scale of things was the biggest difference. We did have an outage at one point that was caused by an accident, and that was the first time I was introduced to this notion of, look, if it's an accident that anyone else could have made in the same circumstances, we're going to learn from it. We're going to recover from it as quickly as we can, and we move on.
Mm-hmm.
If it's an accident that anyone who was the most junior wouldn't have made, we'll deal with that afterwards, which might be some form of punishment. But right now, we've got to recover the environment and move on.
Yeah.
So there's that notion of like, oh, okay, a reasonable mistake, we can learn from it, move on, and it's not career ending right off the bat. We don't go witch hunting just for that. And it was a big mistake that I saw that happen on.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I kind of got introduced to that notion of that.
So kind of like recovery, and then your root cause analysis kind of later.
Yeah,
like,
yeah, and then then you look at, okay, well, how preventable was this in the first place? All of that.
Interesting. And it's interesting to hear what you say about kind of teenagers being, because I have visions of the film, I think it's around the 96 era, so it's kind of around the same sort of time, the film Hackers, that had just loads of teenagers sort of running around. Now I know they probably made loads of errors, but maybe they got the actual persona of the time.
Some of it, yeah. I mean, it was definitely a bit of a free for all. One of the kids just knew that if he followed the sun to some of our other call centers offshore, he could play on certain cultural norms,
right,
as well as the pressure that a lot of the outsourced call centers have on answering a call, resolving that call, all of those things. The more he dragged it on, the worse their numbers looked. So they were more apt to just give him whatever it took to get off the call. And he got them to the point where they'd be like, all right, what do you want me to download?
Wow. Right.
He had this thing for human nature, and he understood that. And that's actually one of the biggest things for me around security, is understanding the human element of it. Like, why is it when we look at look at the Colonial Pipeline recently, right? You look at this massive enterprise that impacts American lives, and their security, outwardly at least, was laughable, at least from what you hear. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was. But then you ask, well, everyone knows what the best practices are. Why aren't they following the best practices? Exactly. Why is it that we all know what the best practices are, but most organizations don't implement them or don't follow them, or they don't sustain them after a period of time.
Human
And
dynamics.
right, we don't look at any of those elements. I got to work for RSA, and then I got to work with RSA when they had their intrusion while I was in government.
Right.
And part of one of the solutions was going to involve some segmenting of some environments. And the way it was going to be done, at the suggestion of another element of the US government, was very manual. It was going to require a lot of human steps to move information, transfer it manually between environments. And I could see where that was going to go. Eventually, the organization was going to lose that memory of the event. Enough people would move on, things of
Yeah.
that sort, and they would look to just reconnect the networks because that's more efficient. So I looked at it and said, look, we have to design the environment in a way that gives them that connectivity, but creates strong gates between them.
Mm-hmm.
In a more automated fashion. If you automate it, they're less likely to undo it. And so that was actually the ultimate way that they went.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? The kind of, as I just sort of touched on, the human dynamic versus folks that are very technically minded, who can, I don't know, see things in a protocol or some code or something that other people just don't see that are there, that perhaps find the edge cases in the code that allow them access, versus someone like you say who is just a very good manipulator of kind of behavior or scenarios. Yeah, no, that's, it's really interesting. And I'm guessing, more recently your role at Homeland Security, that must have been really fascinating to kind of see how government department is effectively kind of trying to keep the nation safe. Talk to me a little bit about your role there. What did day-to-day look like in that role?
Honestly, when I first came on, they were just in a hiring mode, and they truly didn't have an exact plan for what I was going to do when I came in the door my first
Okay.
day. So I kind of made my own role.
Always good when you can get to do that.
Yeah, especially in government where it's usually a lot more rigid,
Yeah.
at least initially. And my focus right off the bat was around that preventative side of things. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what can we learn about the root cause of incidents? What can we find in terms of commonalities? And can we steer people and organizations in a direction towards preventative? So that's kind of how things started. And then I was arguably a bad government employee. I was still in the office at 6 o'clock at night on a Thursday, and I answered my phone, and it was from someone from FBI saying, "Hey, we're sending a team up to New York for an incident. You guys really need to be there." And after a bit of conversation, we didn't deploy teams in the field at that point in time.
Okay. Right.
US just received reports. We kind of coordinated from the back. That's it. But the nature of what was being described, or actually more accurately, wasn't being described on the phone, made it clear I needed to be up there.
Right.
And so I spent 6 weeks in New York City over the holidays in 2010 and through 2011, doing incident response. And it was I think at our peak, we were about 37 people doing a multi-agency response. And this was the first time in government we had done a multi-agency response too. And that's actually what started US CERT doing incident response and me leading and building that program. Okay. So it was just a fateful thing of me having made the right connections with some other agencies, them knowing that they needed to call me, and then just making it happen on the fly. I think from the time that phone rang to the time I stepped on a train to head up to New York, 2 hours had passed. And I just went home, packed a bag, hoping I had enough clothing, and I was gone for most of 6 weeks.
It's interesting what you said about relationships. I think for me that's really key with the kind of your journey through your career, and I echo that myself, is the difference between doing your job as well as building the network internally and externally that helps you do your job or take it to the next level. I think is the difference between someone who is perhaps doing their job well and someone who's doing their job well but is ready for the next step, the next kind of promotion on their career journey.
Yeah, and find all of the EAs, find all the people that do all of the paperwork and logistical stuff on the back end, and get to know them, get to know their pain points, connect them with resources to help their lives become easier.
Yeah.
Because man, when you need them, they're going to be the ones that are going to help you get something done. Or they may just be the one that casually says something that lets you connect dots between another group that's trying to do something, and you can just step in and help with that.
Talking of connecting the dots and stakeholders, what's your engagement been like with security architecture? Or have you even done security architecture yourself? Talk to me a little bit about your experiences of that, given Architect Tomorrow has a reasonable number of security architects.
Honestly, doing the incident response side of things, I usually went to organizations that were frankly under-resourced in security in general. And sometimes even on the IT side as well. So oftentimes I was that person, just, okay, tell me everything about your environment. Tell me all of your systems. Let's kind of be a little bit of an organizational psychologist at the same time.
Map all this out and work out what's going on.
Exactly. In fact, when they had incidents, my favorite thing to do was get all of the different teams, at least a representative from each one, in a room and not tell me about the incident. I actually had them talk to me about their environment. We would use a whiteboard and draw out a cartoonish version of their entire network and get agreement amongst everyone in that room. And my favorite thing would be to have the person tell me something about the network and me looking around the room for someone shaking their head no, or sighing or crossing their arms. And
someone not willing to toe the political line about how things really should be versus how they really are.
And that's actually the huge thing, right? The how things should be by policy or design versus how things are in reality. And you need to be able to read that. So my favorite thing was just get everyone in the room. I'd get the political answer, and then I'd get the real answer by looking at body language. And then, you plant that seed of doubt, like, oh, well, okay, so all DNS is forced through these, official servers, and nowhere else, right? Because, my experience, a lot of organizations, over time, things drift and something leaks through.
Yeah.
And then you get one person that's brave enough to lean forward and goes, well, it'll take us 5 minutes to check. That's all I need, right? And so I'd start with that. Yeah. I'd get an idea of what the environment looks like. And that would set the process for two things for me. One is, where in the network can I set up for monitoring to do the incident response? But then it also starts letting me build the mental picture of what the environment is now and what it needs to be for the remediation and longer term phases of things. Because most of our report was not on the findings of the incident itself. It was on the recommendations for putting them into a more preventative state.
Cleaning up and fixing the basics, and or whatever that might have been. Yeah.
And I have to say that the biggest thing we saw was shelfware. Just in one case, literally still in the boxes, fresh off fresh as in 9 months ago, off the loading dock, firewalls and proxy servers that just had never even been unboxed and put in a rack.
Wow.
But that's common. I mean, I know so many organizations that use end of year funds. If you don't spend it, you don't get your budget for next year. So they just spend it, and they get
security stuff.
Right. I've seen organizations right after an incident go out with a blank check and buy everything, but their ability to implement that stuff with no plan really becomes a problem. It's actually a question I've used for interviewing people. Same kind of concept. I'll put up a cartoonish network diagram, a little bubble of desktop, server, DMZ, internet, and I have them draw a line in the predominant direction of traffic flow between those segments. And then I give them a long list of security related devices or functions. And I say, I'm going to give you an unlimited budget to buy as many of these devices and put them in the network wherever you want. But you have to tell me why you're putting them there. And I'm not going to give you an unlimited budget to manage, or consume the data that comes off those devices.
Right, right.
And I want to see them realize that you can't just put something in the environment just for the sake of it, just because the security book tells me that this is what you're supposed to do.
This is a box you should tick, so spend the money and you get to tick the box.
Right. You actually have to be able to do something useful with that in the context of the larger organization.
Yeah.
And it's an abstract scenario to put someone through, which makes them uncomfortable, which is awesome for interviews. Because I ultimately want someone to say, I don't know, at least once during an interview. If you can't say, I don't know.
It shows you're not a growth person, right? It shows you think you know it all already.
Well, yeah.
No one can. No one in reality can know everything.
Yeah, exactly. And demonstrating a degree of emotional and intellectual maturity.
Yeah. So Chris, look, this has been interesting, but I'm keen to kind of look at today, and obviously Architect Tomorrow is looking at the near future. What's the kind of hot topic or area that's kind of caught your eye at the moment as perhaps, showing the most potential for improving security, or something that's a problematic area that you think is going to be a challenge?
Well, we still have the challenge, obviously, around ransomware. It's rampant. We've got two or three issues there. One, the hygiene issue, with it's allowing it to happen at the rate at which it's happening. The financial incentive for most organizations is to pay the ransom. If you think about what does it take to do a restoration of a single system from offline backup?
Yeah.
How long does that take an organization? Now imagine doing it for the majority of your environment. Most organizations can't sustain, or won't sustain, I should say, the necessary amount of downtime.
No.
The dollar cost of that versus what they're going to pay in a ransom.
Not to mention, of course, folks that haven't perhaps ever tried doing these things and are perhaps scared or unknown. It's an unknown quantity. Can we even restore from that?
Well, and that's a whole other discussion when it comes to being resilient. You actually have to test your processes around that, and not just go restore the operating system. Go pick one of your database servers, restore the data from it, and then have someone actually go through and make sure the data is actually coherent.
Right.
And for the love of God, please don't just simply replicate hot between two data centers. That is not a backup. That's a replication. Because once the data in one gets destroyed, you got bad data in the other.
There's an interesting story there. I'm sure you heard this one, where actually it turned out that a hot replica like that got stale, and that was one of the things that saved an organization.
Yes.
I won't name the organization because it's not fair, because I think they've already been dragged through the mud back in the day when that happened. But yeah, you're right. This assumption that HA is a great thing is true for certain perhaps end user reasons, but for security reasons and for resilience, it's not always desirable, right?
It's not good for disaster recovery.
Yeah.
For general availability and meeting your service level agreements, absolutely.
Yeah. It's that key distinction between HA and DR, high availability and disaster recovery, for people that don't know those acronyms.
Yeah. So I'd say it's the hygiene piece, the fact that people don't do backups that are meaningful, and there's a financial incentive for people to do this. And I'd argue that we almost need to get to a point where we need to make it illegal to pay a ransom, right? Until we can do that, so that we remove the flow of money to these actors. As soon as you remove the flow of money to them, what incentive do they have to keep doing that crime? They'll find another.
I was reading something similar today actually about insurance for ransomware as well. Kind of should that be allowed? So it's interesting, isn't it? It does require some form of step change, or things aren't going to get better.
And there's a diplomatic piece too, where we need to look at the countries that are becoming bastions for the actors behind this, and we need to take some action there. Now, there's a lot of geopolitical issues with some of the countries that are hosting that, but that's also a piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What are your thoughts on kind of organizations shift to the cloud and more contemporary architectures, do you think there's been a lot of debate about whether the cloud is inherently less or more secure? What's your take on kind of transformation to the cloud?
Honestly, the answer is it depends. Cop out answer. It all depends on.
It's a classic architectural answer. So I like that.
It all depends on implementation and what your end goals were in the first place and moving towards it. Right. So outcomes matter. But from a security perspective, it all comes down to implementation. If you're not aware of all the knobs and dials that you need to, could, or should be using to secure it, to monitor it over time, then it can be even more of a liability than a traditional architecture could be. So that's part of it. The other thing is you're going to have components that are going to be in that transition where you're going to have some components still on-prem and then some in cloud, and you're going to have to do that data shuffle between. You may even have some of it that's in cloud, but in a test instance. And the trap of any IT environment is, oh, it's just test. We don't have to worry. And so it doesn't tend to get locked down in the same way and everything else. Well, the number one thing I've ever seen is no one likes generating reliable test data. So they try to use real data, and they'll either try to sanitize it. Hey, that's better than nothing. But most of them don't even go that step.
Yeah, I can neither confirm nor deny from my development career whether that happens, but it's resonating. Yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, again, back to human nature and things of that sort. So just because it's in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean it's innately more secure. There's a lot of opportunities to secure it better. The instrumentation, a whole bunch of things. There's a lot that you could do, but many organizations are not experts in it. They don't know how to do it. Some of the cloud providers are getting some fantastic instrumentation in place with a kind of their own security central that'll tell you a lot of this.
Yeah.
So it's getting easier to do some of that security stuff, but there's still a lot of opportunity to screw it up. One of the things I'm looking for out of COVID, because there was that just rush to support anything, get it into the cloud, make sure people working from home can get to it. I'm waiting for more misconfiguration related data exposures over the next year that resulted from people's rush to cloud during COVID.
I think that's a really interesting one, isn't it? We've certainly seen knee-jerk sort of reactions to remote work, and cloud hosted productivity tools have clearly had a massive rise, haven't they? But how many folks are really considering the risks of that implementation? They're probably focused on getting it to their lines of business units as quickly as possible, and not thinking about, hang on, what about that option for not sharing externally, or whatever hidden setting it might be, it might be missed.
Yeah. So I mean, old school is I can get my hands around it literally. I could walk to a data center, I could put my fingers on that machine.
Yeah.
And so there's some of that in there. Early on with cloud, in the earliest days of it, my joke when people ask me about cloud computing was that clouds are made of water vapor and dust particles, neither of which are good for computers. And that was just my way of conveying that, I'm a lot more cautious about this. And in the early days, I think that caution was appropriate. Now it's more of how do we get there in the way that's most cost effective and secure for the organization. Not even should we go there, it's how do we get there in the best way possible.
Jumping back a little bit, you mentioned IT and security hygiene. For folks who haven't come across that terminology, how would you describe what that's all about?
It's everything from knowing what's in your environment. So what computers are in your environment, what's running on those computers. Nowadays with VMs and stuff of that sort, just because the physical asset doesn't mean that there aren't 3 different computers effectively running on top of that.
Yeah.
How are they patched? What are the versioning? at Tanium, we just did an assessment, a gap assessment of an organization, and on a whim, the guys that were running it added in some new data, and I reviewed it, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. It was Microsoft licensing information.
Okay.
And it would tell you whether it was an OEM license, a retail license, and so on, or whether it was a bulk license. And if it's a retail license or an OEM license, chances are that system has never been built from a gold image.
Right.
It's got all of the bloatware,
all the default stuff.
Exactly.
Right.
And so it comes down to even knowing if those types of things exist in your environment, because all those extra little applications, they might have vulnerabilities in them. And you're probably not monitoring for that. You're not actively managing most of those things to update them on a regular basis. And that's the other piece of this, right? You have to know what you have so that you can then manage it. And managing it means updating it, maybe slimming it down to reduce the attack surface, because hey, we don't need these applications on the set of systems.
Brilliant, Chris. Well, look, so let's go right back to the beginning again, where we started the conversation, which was your kind of career journey. What's your, perhaps, a couple of bits of advice for anyone in 2021 thinking about starting a career in cybersecurity?
First and foremost, I'm looking for critical thinkers, problem solvers, people who can use past knowledge that they've acquired to take a complex problem, break it down into smaller pieces, use the existing things they know how to do, and begin to attack that, and deal with different things every day. Ideally in the security world, it's new and different each day. So if you're excited by that, if you're really someone who wants to roll up your sleeves and work on new problems, and understand that your job is to help an organization do things securely, not to tell them no, they can't do something, then that's the first thing. Like if you can get around that mindset, come on in. And oh, by the way, if you're an English lit major, if you're an anthropology major, but you are a strong critical thinker, I'll teach you the cyber pieces. So if you're not in a traditional starting point for security, don't exclude yourself from it. Right? If it's an interest, and you have that demonstrated aptitude for problem solving, find someone to mentor you. You can learn the cyber pieces easily enough.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think some of the people I've come across in tech who've solved problems in a completely different way than I would have expected are those that have perhaps come from a non-traditional background and have learned along the way, and because they just see things from a different perspective, which I think is really important in a field like cybersecurity, where you need, as you say, that critical thinking sort of from different aspects and different angles. So great advice, Chris. Thanks for your time. Thanks for coming on again and supporting the community. It's much appreciated.
Always happy to chat. I like this.
Great stuff, Chris. Well, I look forward to speaking to you again soon, but in the meantime, take care.